Philippine Sea, October 24, 1944, nightfall. Darkness spread across the Pacific like ink spilled from a shattered bottle. The ocean was quiet. But beneath it, death moved silently. A sleek, black shadow, the USS Tang, one of the most successful American submarines of the war, stalked a Japanese convoy cutting through the night. 5 freighters, 2 escorts, all unaware. Inside the submarine, red lights dimly illuminated the control room. Captain Richard O'Kane peered through the periscope. His voice was calm, decisive. Fire 1. A click, a hiss, then silence. Far ahead, a massive explosion erupted. A Japanese transport split in half, consumed by fire and water. Then another, and another. In less than 10 minutes, the USS Tang had launched 6 torpedoes. All hit their mark. But then came the final shot. The last torpedo. The one that would define not just the Tang, but the future of submarine warfare itself. Because this torpedo turned back. A single weapon, meant to end the war faster, instead sealed the fate of America's finest submarine. And in that moment, everything changed. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, America's submarine fleet was tasked with a bold and critical mission: to strangle Japan's empire by cutting off its supply lines. The challenge was immense. Japan's economy and military machine depended entirely on ships: oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, rice from Burma, and troops moving from island to island. Without this lifeline, Japan would slowly choke. But the U.S. Navy's submarines, though brave and eager, were doomed to fail in the early years. The problem wasn't the crews, it was the torpedoes. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard-issue weapon for U.S. submarines, was a mechanical nightmare. It often ran too deep, passed harmlessly beneath ships. When it hit, the magnetic exploder frequently misfired. Even when it struck cleanly, the contact exploder was so fragile that the torpedo simply bounced off a ship's hull. Submarine commanders reported hit after hit, and 0 explosions. But Washington didn't believe them. The Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo development, insisted the problem was with the crews, not the weapons. It took 2 years of catastrophic failure before the Navy admitted what every submariner already knew. The Mark 14 was broken. Between December 1941 and mid-1943, more than 1,000 American torpedoes were fired. The confirmed hit rate? Barely 20%. For submariners risking their lives to line up perfect shots, it was a cruel betrayal. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan's own torpedo technology was terrifyingly advanced. The Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, mounted on Japanese destroyers and cruisers, was the most lethal torpedo in the world. Using pure oxygen propulsion, it had unmatched speed, range, and explosive power. It could strike from 20,000 yards away, far beyond American expectation, and sink even a heavy cruiser with a single hit. At the naval battles of Savo Island, Java Sea, and Guadalcanal, U.S. ships were devastated by surprise torpedo attacks. American submarines, designed to be silent predators, were now the hunted. By 1942, the situation had become desperate. U.S. submarines were sinking far fewer Japanese ships than intelligence predicted. Every failed torpedo run meant more fuel, ammunition, and troops reaching enemy shores. And the price of failure wasn't just strategic. It was personal. Submariners risked everything for a chance to take the war to the enemy. They operated in extreme isolation. Long patrols, constant danger, few chances to surface, and the ever-present threat of depth charges. For these men, every shot mattered. To line up a perfect intercept, maneuver beneath a convoy, calculate speed and bearing, evade escorts, only to watch your torpedo pass harmlessly by? It was soul-crushing. Some commanders lost their nerve. Others ignored orders and began testing torpedoes themselves. In one famous incident, Commander Charles Swede Momsen of the USS Wahoo ran live fire trials and confirmed what many suspected. The exploders were defective. His reward? A reprimand. But slowly evidence piled up. Investigations began. Skepticism gave way to hard data. The Mark 14 was recalled, the exploders redesigned, the depth-keeping system re-engineered. Still, years had been lost, lives wasted, and Japan's shipping lanes remained dangerously open. But the tide was about to turn. By late 1943, a new breed of submarine officer was rising. Men like Richard O'Kane, Eugene Fluckey, and George Street were bold, aggressive, and no longer willing to accept mediocrity. Their patrols became deadly precise, their tactics innovative, and their confidence, finally, backed by torpedoes that actually worked. And behind the scenes, a quiet revolution was taking place in torpedo technology, not just fixing the Mark 14, but creating something far more dangerous. By the fall of 1943, America had begun fixing what had nearly crippled its submarine campaign, the torpedo. The Mark 14, once feared for all the wrong reasons, was finally working. After 2 years of denial, testing proved the contact exploder needed reinforcement, the magnetic exploder was unreliable and had to be deactivated, and depth controls had to be recalibrated. With these corrections, the Mark 14 became lethal, finally delivering the punch its designers had promised. But it wasn't just a fix, it was a transformation. The U.S. Navy, desperate for a technological leap, didn't stop at repairs. Engineers began working on a new weapon, inspired by captured German design. Unlike the steam-driven Mark 14, the Mark 18 was powered by batteries. It left no visible wake, no telltale trail of bubbles. To enemy lookouts and escorts, it was as if nothing had been fired at all, until the explosion. The design was adapted from the German G7E torpedo, salvaged from U-boat wrecks. But American engineers improved it. They addressed German weaknesses: contact reliability, power loss over range, and recharge limits. By mid-1944, submarines like the USS Tang and USS Barb carried both models, Mark 14S for long-range attacks, and Mark 18S for silent, deadly work in close quarters. It changed the nature of submarine warfare. Now, American boats could approach convoys undetected, fire multiple torpedoes without giving away their position, and slip away before the first explosion was heard. But the revolution wasn't just in torpedoes, it was in the people. Commanders like Richard O'Kane, formerly the executive officer under the legendary Dudley "Mush" Morton aboard USS Wahoo, brought new tactics, relentless aggression, and cold precision to every patrol. O'Kane's new command, the USS Tang, was a Ballot-class submarine armed with the latest tech. By her 5th war patrol, the Tang had sunk over 90,000 tons of Japanese shipping. That number would nearly double in one final mission. Meanwhile, Eugene Fluckey, commander of the USS Barb, pioneered night surface attacks, turning submarines into temporary surface raiders. With radar guidance and electric torpedoes, his boat would launch surprise attacks at high speed, fire spreads of torpedoes, then disappear into the dark. These commanders no longer stalked from a distance. They struck hard and vanished faster, and the results were immediate. From mid-1943 to mid-1945, American submarines would sink over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling more than 5.3 million tons of cargo. This wasn't just impressive, it was decisive. Japan, an island empire, depended entirely on shipping. Every torpedo that sank an oiler, troop transport, or cargo freighter was a dagger in the empire's heart. Factories stalled without raw materials. Soldiers starved on distant islands. Fuel shortages crippled naval operations. By 1945, Japanese destroyers were tied to dock because there was no oil to move them. Army units in the Philippines and New Guinea were cut off, left to rot, surrender, or starve. The turning point didn't come from grand battleships or aircraft carriers. It came from beneath the waves, from quiet men, hunting in steel coffins, firing torpedoes in silence. And of all the weapons they carried, the Mark 18 became the quiet reaper. But no weapon comes without risk. Unlike steam-powered torpedoes, the Mark 18's electric propulsion system lacked visual indicators of malfunction. If the gyro misaligned, if the depth control failed, if the guidance system glitched, the torpedo could circle, and on October 25, 1944, one of them did. The USS Tang, under Captain O'Kane, had already sunk 4 ships in a single night. As it fired its last torpedo, the 24th of its patrol, it turned back. The Mark 18 curved silently in the dark, re-entered the Tang's firing arc, and struck home. The explosion ripped the submarine in two. Out of 87 men, only 9 survived, all captured by Japanese forces. And yet, even in death, the Tang's legacy was complete. Her final patrol had sunk over 10 ships, more than any other submarine patrol in U.S. Navy history. It was the perfect, tragic symbol of how far America's submarine force had come. From broken torpedoes and disbelief to surgical strikes that crippled an empire. From desperation to dominance, and at the heart of that transformation was a weapon built in silence, an electric blade that changed everything it touched. Before 1943, a typical American submarine patrol was a study in frustration. Commanders stalked enemy convoys for days, braving destroyer screens, aircraft patrols, and mechanical failure, only to watch torpedoes run too deep, veer off course, or strike with a dull thud. Every engagement risked the lives of the crew, and too often ended with nothing to show. The result? Missed opportunities, emboldened enemies, shaken morale. But once the torpedo problems were fixed, everything changed. Submarine attacks evolved from hopeful gambles to lethal science. Commanders now knew, if they could line up a shot, the torpedo would do its job. The effect was transformative. Submarine patrols became more aggressive, tactics became bolder, and the Japanese merchant fleet paid the price. By late 1943, American submarines began employing end-around attacks, surfacing under the cover of darkness, sprinting ahead of a convoy, submerging to ambush from the front. With functional torpedoes and radar-guided approaches, these tactics became brutally effective. During the USS Barb's 8th patrol, Commander Eugene Fluckey used such a tactic to launch a night attack that sank 4 ships in under 10 minutes, then evaded depth charge retaliation by fleeing at flank speed on the surface. Radar-blind Japanese escorts left guessing. No longer passive stalkers, submarines became ambush predators, and the shift was measurable. From 1942 to 1943, the U.S. submarine fleet more than doubled its monthly sinkings, and by 1944, those numbers had doubled again. The curve wasn't gradual, it was exponential. Behind that curve was a single, silent weapon: the reliable torpedo. If the Mark 14 was a hammer, the Mark 18 was a scalpel. Its electric propulsion, borrowed from captured German G7E models, meant no visible wake. No bubbles, no warning, and most importantly, no trail for enemy escorts to follow. Suddenly, a submarine could fire from just 1,000 yards and vanish. In the dense heat of the Pacific night, with sonar scrambled by thermal layers and radar blind to undersea movement, the Mark 18 was a ghost. Japanese escorts often never realized they were under attack until the first explosion. And by then, it was too late. But the Mark 18 wasn't just about stealth, it was about reliability. Where the Mark 14 had failed repeatedly in magnetic and contact detonation, the Mark 18 was simple, and simplicity saved lives. Its contact exploder was hardened, its battery design stable. It didn't overheat. It didn't dive too deep. It worked, and it was fast enough, 29 knots, to intercept most Japanese cargo vessels with ease. There were limitations, of course. Its range, about 4,000 yards, was shorter than steam torpedoes. Its speed was slightly slower, and once launched, it lacked the same gyro corrections as later homing torpedoes. But the trade was worth it. Submarines now had a choice: use Mark 14 at long range when stealth wasn't vital, or deploy Mark 18 up close for surgical strikes. The combination gave submarine commanders the flexibility to adapt to any convoy scenario, and in the hands of tacticians like Richard O'Kane, it became an art form. On the Tang's fifth and final patrol, O'Kane used both torpedo types to devastating effect, firing spreads from multiple angles, diving between freighters, surfacing to reposition, then striking again. In just one night, he sank 5 ships using these dual tactics, a record unequaled by any other submarine in U.S. history. It was the ultimate expression of technological advantage meeting operational mastery. And it was only possible because, for the first time in the war, the weapons matched the bravery of the men who used them. For much of the early Pacific War, Japanese merchant captains and naval escorts operated with confidence. Their convoys were vast, their destroyers well-armed, and American submarines, plagued with broken torpedoes, were more annoyance than threat. But by 1944, that confidence was shattered. The transformation in U.S. torpedo performance, particularly the deployment of the silent Mark 18, created a new kind of fear, one that couldn't be seen or fought directly. Ships were now vanishing from convoys without warning. No bubble trails, no splashes, no warnings shouted from the bridge. Just thunder from beneath. Steel ripped apart. Fires in the hold. Screams from below decks. The Japanese began calling them Kage no Senshi, warriors of shadow. Convoy commanders became paranoid. Escorts wasted depth charges on empty water. Sleep-deprived watchmen searched for torpedo wakes that no longer existed. Rumors spread through the fleet of American submarines with supernatural powers. Some claimed the U.S. had developed invisible weapons, but the truth was far more terrifying. The weapons weren't invisible, just perfected. Even the famed Japanese Hell ships, transporters of Allied POWs, weren't spared. In multiple tragic instances, American submarines, unaware of the human cargo, torpedoed these ships, resulting in thousands of Allied deaths. It was a chilling reminder. The weapons were precise. But the war was messy. Still, the psychological effect on Japan's war effort was immense. Merchant captains refused dangerous routes. Entire shipping lanes were abandoned. The Japanese Imperial Navy diverted destroyers, desperately needed for fleet actions, to protect convoys instead. By 1945, the Empire's maritime network had become a graveyard of twisted hulls and oil slicks. The torpedo had done what no bombing campaign or naval battle could. No discussion of American torpedo warfare is complete without facing its darkest truth. The same technology that empowered victory also delivered tragic irony. On the night of October 24, 1944, during what would become the most successful patrol in U.S. submarine history, the USS Tang fired its final torpedo. 23 had already been launched. All had hit. The convoy was in ruins. Fires lit the horizon. Survivors clung to debris. Then came number 24, the final Mark 18. Launched at close range, the torpedo curved slightly, then slowed. Whether due to a gyro malfunction or depth error, no one aboard Tang knew at first. Moments later, sonar reported an anomaly. The torpedo had circled. Captain Richard O'Kane gave the order to dive. But it was too late. The Mark 18, their own weapon, slammed into the Tang's aft section. The resulting explosion shattered the pressure hull, flooded compartments, and sent the submarine plunging to the bottom of the Formosa Strait. Only 9 men survived, escaping through a single functional forward hatch. They were captured, interrogated, and spent the rest of the war in brutal captivity. The rest of the crew perished, victims of a weapon they trusted, a weapon that had defined their dominance. The story of the Tang is both a tale of triumph and a solemn warning. No matter how advanced a weapon becomes, it can always turn back. The Mark 18 was not flawed in design. Its error was mechanical, a rare, tragic miscalculation. But it underscored an eternal truth of war. Every advancement carries risk. Every technological leap, no matter how decisive, walks the edge of catastrophe. And for the families of the men aboard Tang, the final irony was almost unbearable. They had fought with perfect precision. They had destroyed the enemy, but they died by the hand of their own success. Yet even in death, their mission had changed history. The convoys they destroyed never delivered their cargo. The ships they sank were irreplaceable. And the legacy they left, of courage, of mastery, and of sacrifice, became the silent foundation of America's undersea dominance for decades to come. October 1944, Formosa Strait, just north of Luzon. The war in the Pacific was entering its final ferocious phase. American forces had landed on Leyte in the Philippines. The Japanese were launching a desperate naval counterattack, a last-ditch attempt to halt the U.S. advance. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was unfolding across 100,000 square miles of sea. And in the shadows of this colossal fight, one submarine was rewriting history. The USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, was on its 5th war patrol. The mission: intercept enemy shipping fleeing from the battlefront, sever their retreat, and annihilate the last logistical arteries keeping Japanese forces alive in the Philippines. Tang was no ordinary sub. Her previous 4 patrols had already sunk 17 Japanese ships. O'Kane, known for his calm nerve, aggressive instincts, and unshakable precision, was at the peak of his powers. The boat was loaded with 24 torpedoes, a mix of Mark 14 and Mark 18 electrics. Her crew was experienced, tight-knit, and battle-hardened. Her engines ran clean. Her radar was flawless. She had become a predator. On the night of October 23rd, Tang detected a heavily escorted Japanese convoy, cargo ships, troop transports, and supply vessels heading from Formosa to reinforce Luzon. O'Kane maneuvered ahead of the formation, submerged beneath a thermal layer, and waited. At 0200 hours, he fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 5 hits. 2 transports exploded instantly, throwing flaming debris across the water. One oiler burst into a rising column of black smoke. The convoy fell into chaos, zigzagging, slowing down, colliding. Escorts fanned out, depth charges fell blindly. Tang slipped beneath them and vanished. She surfaced hours later and repeated the maneuver. Another convoy, another ambush, another 5 ships lost. In less than 24 hours, USS Tang had sunk over 30,000 tons of enemy shipping. And she wasn't finished. On the evening of October 24th, the Tang approached yet another convoy, this one tightly packed, with minimal escort but vital cargo. Intelligence would later reveal these ships carried fuel, medical supplies, and troops bound for Manila. At 0530, in near pitch-black waters, Tang fired another spread. 4 torpedoes. 4 hits. Burning ships illuminated the dark, like floating lanterns of death. But this time, something was different. Tang's final torpedo, number 24, malfunctioned shortly after launch. Observers in the conning tower noticed an odd sonar echo, then another. The contact reappeared, closer this time. The torpedo had circled. Commander O'Kane ordered emergency dive, full rudder, maximum depth. Too late. At 0555, the Mark 18 torpedo, meant for a fleeing freighter, curved back and slammed directly into Tang's aft section. The explosion was deafening. Compartments flooded instantly. The boat shuddered, pitched nose down, and began to sink. Chaos erupted inside, lights failed, bulkheads collapsed, machinery tore loose. Incredibly, a forward compartment survived intact, flooded, but with breathable air. 9 sailors, including O'Kane, managed to seal the hatch and begin the ascent. With no escape trunk functioning, they used a single emergency escape breathing apparatus, surfacing one by one in freezing water under Japanese searchlights. They were picked up by an enemy frigate, ironically the very ship they had tried to sink. In captivity they were beaten, interrogated, starved. But the truth eventually emerged. The USS Tang, in a single patrol, had sunk 33,000 tons of enemy shipping. Her total wartime toll reached 116,454 tons, the most by any American submarine in World War II. She had become both the sword and the wound, the sharpest edge of American technology, and the victim of its final flaw. In the aftermath of USS Tang's final patrol, the scale of destruction she inflicted began to ripple across Japanese command. 6 ships lost in a single night, 10 in one patrol, vital supplies destroyed, thousands of tons of war materiel, fuel, ammunition, medical cargo, now resting on the ocean floor. Even before Tang's loss was confirmed, Japanese naval records registered the chaos. The once orderly convoys were now disorganized, fearful, and increasingly reluctant to sail without heavy escort, resources Japan could no longer spare. The Formosa Strait, once a critical artery for troop movement and logistics, had become a death trap. O'Kane's final patrol wasn't just impressive, it was decisive. It marked the first time in the Pacific War that an American submarine had completely shut down a major Japanese convoy route during a critical battle phase. And Tang wasn't alone. Other submarines, like the USS Barb, USS Archerfish, and USS Dace, were conducting equally daring missions. But it was the Tang's combination of tactical precision, lethal torpedoes, and aggressive command that set her apart. When Japan attempted its last major naval sortie, the disastrous Shogo operations during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, their ships were critically undersupplied. Fuel shortages plagued every task force. Coordination between Army and Navy forces collapsed due to lost communications and delayed reinforcements. Historians later argued, had those convoys reached Luzon in time, the battle for the Philippines might have lasted months longer, with thousands more American and Filipino casualties. Instead, they were vaporized in the strait. But Tang's impact went beyond the battlefield. Her loss, by her own torpedo, sent a shockwave through the U.S. Navy's torpedo development programs. The Mark 18, though still considered a technological success, was placed under immediate review. Engineers re-evaluated its gyroscopic guidance systems, added safeguards to reduce circular runs, and pushed forward the development of acoustic homing torpedoes like the Mark 27 Cutie and Mark 28. What began as imitation of German designs evolved into American superiority. Within months, new torpedoes could lock onto the engine noise of enemy vessels, ensuring lethal strikes even against maneuvering targets. The technological arms race beneath the waves was tilting decisively toward the Allies, and commanders like O'Kane, who survived prison camps and returned after the war, brought first-hand experience into post-war submarine doctrine. He trained a new generation of officers. He wrote books. He became a symbol of excellence, a reminder that perfection in war demands both brilliance and sacrifice. The legacy of USS Tang was immortalized not just in tonnage sunk or medals earned, though she earned more than any other submarine in the fleet, but in how she fought. Her patrols represented the apex of submarine warfare in World War II. Technology that finally matched the mission. Tactics that redefined what a stealth attack could achieve. And a commander whose instinct, precision, and courage created the deadliest patrol in U.S. naval history. She didn't die in failure. She died at her peak. And in doing so, she ended an era, one defined by trial, error, and near defeat, and ushered in the final phase of Pacific naval dominance. The American submarine force had come full circle, from the silent desperation of 1942 to the ghostly perfection of 1944. And behind it all was a single weapon, one torpedo, that had redefined not just a battle, but an entire war. By the start of 1945, Japan's maritime empire, once vast, efficient, and essential, was dying by inches, not from aircraft carriers, not from battleships, but from the quiet, deliberate work of submarines and the torpedoes they unleashed. The numbers tell the story. In 1942, U.S. submarines had sunk around 180,000 tons of enemy shipping. In 1943, that number climbed to over 700,000 tons. By 1944, the year of the Tang's final patrol, it had reached a staggering 1.5 million tons. And in 1945, during the war's final months, American subs added another 1.3 million tons to the ledger. All told, the U.S. submarine fleet accounted for more than 55% of all Japanese shipping lost during the war. Out of 6 million tons of merchant marine at the start of the war, more than 5 million were sunk, most of it by torpedoes. These weren't just numbers. Every cargo freighter destroyed meant aircraft engines that never arrived. Every tanker lost meant destroyers stuck in port. Every troop ship sunk meant reinforcement that drowned before reaching the front. By late 1944, Japanese factories were short of rubber, oil, and steel. Civilians rationed rice and fuel. Island garrisons were cut off, starving in place, unable to retreat or resupply. Even in massive fleet battles, like the Battle of the Philippine Sea or the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy was already dying before it engaged, bled dry of fuel and logistics long before American planes arrived overhead. Submarines like the Tang, Barb, Darter, and Celian had paved the way, and torpedoes, once a symbol of failure, had become the scalpel that severed an empire. The psychological toll was no less devastating. In post-war interrogations, captured Japanese officers admitted they feared American submarines more than aircraft. Unlike bombers or surface ships, submarines offered no warning, no sound, no pattern. You could be sailing under clear skies, with no enemy in sight, and vanish in seconds. Convoy commanders began avoiding traditional sea lanes, but these longer, circuitous routes burned more fuel, delayed critical shipments, and still offered no guarantee of safety. Some convoys were ordered to travel only at night, others restricted radio use to avoid detection. None of it worked. Submarines adapted faster, and their weapons, silent, deep, and now deadly accurate, made every ocean a potential grave. But the toll wasn't just taken on the Japanese. U.S. submariners paid dearly for their success. Out of 288 American submarines deployed in World War II, 52 were lost, nearly 1 in 5. Over 3,500 submariners never returned. Depth charge attacks, equipment failures, accidental sinkings, friendly fire, collisions, and as in the case of the USS Tang, torpedoes that turned back. The submarine campaign was effective, but it was never safe. Submariners accepted these risks. They volunteered for long patrols. They endured crushing pressure, psychological stress, and the knowledge that a single leak or electrical fault could mean instant death. They fought with one eye on the enemy and the other on their own machines. Because in submarine warfare, the sea is always your enemy, even when the torpedo hits its mark. And yet, despite all risks, the American submarine force emerged from the Pacific War as one of the most effective combat arms in military history. Just 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel served aboard submarines. But they accounted for over half of all Japanese shipping losses. And their precision attacks, enabled by weapons like the Mark 18, devastated Japan's ability to wage war. This was not an accident. It was the result of lessons learned the hard way, of failed torpedoes turned into perfected designs, of commanders who refused to accept excuses, of crews who trusted their captain and their torpedo tubes with their lives. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, its economy lay in ruins, its navy paralyzed, and its islands cut off, not just by bombers and blockades, but by American torpedoes. Weapons once doubted, now decisive. As peace returned to the Pacific, the men who had fought in steel coffins beneath the sea quietly stepped ashore. There were no parades for the submarine force in 1945, no massive headlines or Hollywood films. While carriers and marines were celebrated for their island victories, submariners and the torpedoes they had unleashed remained largely unseen, unspoken, and under-recognized. But history would correct that silence. Over time, the U.S. Navy came to understand just how devastating the submarine campaign had been, and how much it owed to a single evolution in warfare, the transformation of the torpedo. The Mark 18 and the improved Mark 14 had turned submarines from passive scouts into decisive killers. They gave commanders like Richard O'Kane, Eugene Fluckey, and George Street the tools they needed to dominate the Pacific. They made it possible to engage enemy convoys with confidence and win. By war's end, the success of submarine warfare reshaped U.S. naval doctrine. The lessons learned from torpedo reliability, target tracking, sonar-guided approaches, and crew resilience became the foundation of post-war undersea warfare. In 1949, the U.S. Navy commissioned the Submarine Combat Patrol insignia, a silent recognition for those who had completed successful wartime patrols. The insignia bore the image of a submarine with a torpedo beneath it, framed by stars. A fitting symbol. The weapon that had once betrayed its users had become their badge of honor. The story of USS Tang, in particular, became immortalized. After returning from captivity, Commander Richard O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor for his final patrol, the most successful single mission by a U.S. submarine in history. His post-war writings and lectures educated an entire generation of naval officers. He became a legend, not just for his bravery, but for his advocacy in fixing what was broken, trusting his instincts, and believing that no system, not even the Navy itself, was beyond question. He spoke often about the responsibility of command, about risk, and about the need for relentless innovation, even in wartime. The Tang's wreck was eventually discovered at the bottom of the Formosa Strait, her twisted hull a silent tomb. But her impact echoed across oceans. In her wake came new torpedoes, wire-guided, acoustic homing, nuclear-tipped, and the dawn of the Cold War submarine arms race. What began as a desperate effort to sink enemy freighters had become a new era of deterrence and deep-sea dominance. And what of the Japanese? Post-war naval officials, when interviewed during occupation, often cited submarines, not bombs, as the greatest threat to their war effort. One admiral, when asked what caused the downfall of Japan's maritime empire, simply said, "The torpedo. That invisible assassin. We feared it more than the sky." The story of how one American torpedo redefined naval warfare isn't just about steel and explosives. It's about how innovation, forced by failure, driven by loss, can change the outcome of a war. It's about how a single malfunctioning weapon, when corrected, can unlock the full potential of an entire combat arm. And it's about how technology, when placed in the hands of courageous men, can become more than a machine. It can become a legacy. In the grand saga of World War II, the story of the torpedo is rarely told. It doesn't soar like a bomber. It doesn't roar like a tank. It moves in silence, unseen, uncelebrated. But in the Pacific, it became the scalpel that bled an empire. The Mark 14, flawed yet salvaged. The Mark 18, silent and deadly. Together, they transformed submarines from underdogs to executioners. The lesson wasn't just in engineering, it was in persistence. American submariners didn't give up when their weapons failed. They demanded answers, they tested, they adapted, and when the technology finally matched their bravery, they rewrote the map of the Pacific, one torpedo at a time. Men like Richard O'Kane didn't simply follow orders. They shaped history from below the waves, one intercept course, one firing solution, one impossible escape at a time. They understood something essential. That war isn't won just by strength, but by precision. Not just by courage, but by correction. Not just by invention, but by relentless refinement. The final irony of the USS Tang, sunk by her own torpedo, serves as both a tragedy and a truth. That even in mastery, risk remains. That even perfection comes with a cost. And that every innovation, no matter how advanced, still carries the fingerprints of human hands. The Pacific was vast, the war was brutal, but in the silence beneath the surface, a revolution occurred. One torpedo at a time, and the world would never fight the same way again.